Howdy, and here we go. We're going to look now at spongy and compact bone and also some cell types that we associate with the osseous or bone tissue. First, let's remind ourselves of the basic bone types, the ones that we just mentioned, that we're going to find two basic kinds of bone tissue. We're going to find compact bone, and compact bone is a bone that we associate with being very dense and on the outside of bone. So when you're holding in lab a bone, a tibia or a humerus, and you got your hand around it, you're feeling the compact bone. The inner layer of some bone tissue, some bones are going to have this cancellous, also known as spongy bone. And you see here it looks a lot more spot or webbish, but we'll consider both kinds. And it's important to consider these because, as we said before, the skeleton has different kinds of functions, and bone has different kinds of functions. And we'll see compact bone has sort of a different mission, if you will, than cancellous bone. So let me go up here. So let's start with compact bone. And when you look at compact bone, again, you associate the bone you're holding with compact bone. That's that smooth, strong bone on the outside of a humerus or a tibia or an ulna. In reality, this bone actually is porous. It has holes through it because passing through different parts of this, you can see this from the slide. We're going to have blood vessels that must pass through regions of this bone. So despite its smooth appearance and despite its being very dense, it actually does have channels that pass through it. And that brings us to then the organization of this bone. The bone has units that make it up called osteons. You may also see the term Haversian system. That term is also still used. But this refers to these cylinders that you see kind of sticking up here. Here's an osteon, here's one, over here's one, over here's one in the back. These osteons are kind of the functional unit, the organizational unit of compact bone. What an osteon has, what it's made up of, it's made up of a central canal, and this is called a central canal or Haversian canal. Is this channel through which blood vessels pass through and nerves pass through. You don't see the nerves on this view, but nerves, trust me, pass through Haversian canals. So that's the center of an osteon. And then you see these delicate rings that make up the osteon. Here's one, here's the next one, here's the next one after that. They look like little tree rings. These rings are actually called, each one is singular, is called a lamella or lamellae plural, make up these individual rings that look again like tree rings. What these lamellae actually are collagen fibers as well as the phosphates and the calcium that make up bone. They're laid down in a matrix pattern. And by that I mean, I don't have a good view to show you this, but the collagen fibers in one lamellae are all going to run one direction, and the next lamellae, they're all going to run a different direction. What this does, for people who have some building background, is it gives this osteon a lot of strength. It's able to withstand a lot of pressure and force, and of course that is one function we associate with compact bone, is that they can handle forces and tension and stress. So the lamellae, again, are made of individual, the collagen and the calcium and phosphate make up the lamellae, but the collagen runs in different directions, so we have a stronger osteon as a result. These, again, individual rings are the result of different growth cycles, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And just the reason you have rings at all is where the ring actually is where you have less collagen. So it appears to us that you actually have a ring there. So the lamellae are going to be making up the osteons. There are actually a couple other kinds of lamellae that are not shown on here. I'll go ahead and type this up for you. You can have a lamellae called, interstitial lamellae. That is going to be one where it's going to be like right in here. It's sort of the lamellae in between other osteons that kind of got squeezed off or destroyed. As bone grows, a process we'll talk about more in a moment, well, another video, as bone grows, you can damage other lamellae, and you have these then remnants of lamellae called interstitial lamellae in between there. On the outside, you also have some other kinds of lamellae. These are called circumferential lamellae that make up these longer lamellae or rings. Those actually give the bone some strength so that bone doesn't get twisted. Okay, that helps you understand an osteon, but to really get what's going on inside of a bone, you have to go a little deeper. So they pulled a piece of an osteon away for us to look at. They've magnified it. So now we see this osteon slice. These are individual lamellar rings, where the cursor is going here. Those are individual lamellar rings. And again, those are made of collagen and calcium and phosphate, and some other things are mixed in there too. But that gives us the lamellar rings. In between lamellar rings, though, there's going to be these little containers or compartments called lacuna. The lacuna are what I think of as apartments, and each of them has an occupant. Each of these has an osteocyte, and you see up here, oops, still on this. Osteocytes are going to be the cells that are live cells, so they live in these lacuna, and therefore they're going to need a blood supply, and therefore they're going to need to have nutrients brought to them, and that's again why we have a vascular nature of blood. But the osteocytes help maintain this matrix. Their job is to report out if we need to build extra bone mass, and we'll talk about the bone building process a little bit later. But they are actually there to help maintain the bone matrix so that it's strong enough. The osteocytes communicate with each other through a caniculus. Caniculae is plural, but a caniculus is these little, it's like cracks. But these are channels that allow osteocytes to touch and talk to one another so that they are communicating amongst themselves about the bone stability and whether or not we need to add more bone mass. So that gives you a pretty good take on compact bone. We need to also then figure out how we're going to nourish it. The periosteum you see down here, the periosteum is this tough, fibrous connective tissue that makes up the outside of the bone, but it also has these periosteal blood vessels that are part of it as well. These periosteal, remember para means around or on the outside of, and then ostea, bone. These periosteal blood vessels actually also run through these somewhat horizontal channels so they can nourish all the bone tissue. These horizontal channels are called Folkman's canals. I know you see the V there, but it's actually pronounced with an F. Folkman's canals are these horizontal channels that allow blood to come from the outside, from the rest of the circulatory system, to the periosteal blood vessels, and then into wherever it needs to go. Do note where these blood vessels are, though, because we'll talk a little bit later about, again, bone growth, and these periosteal blood vessels are quite important in one kind of bone growth. So before we move on, just as a quick refresher here, we're talking about compact bone. We're talking about bone that's strong. It's got mineralization. It's got collagen. It's innervated. It has a nervous system supply. It has a blood supply via the periosteal blood vessels and the Haversian canals, and it's a very dynamic tissue. It's going to respond to stress, and it's going to respond to lack of stress appropriately. Well, then let's move on to spongy bone. Spongy bone is going to, again, look like it's a disorganized mess compared to compact bone. We see kind of these beams running different directions. These beams are called trabeculae, and sometimes spongy bone is also called trabecular bone. You see a term up here also called cancellous. Cancellous and trabecular and spongy bone all mean the same thing. But the spongy bone is organized differently. These trabeculae, again, while they appear to be kind of running random directions, actually do organize along lines of stress. So they do provide some extra stress support on the inside of these bones where you find them. And you tend to find spongy bone a lot of times in the heads of bones. Here we're looking at the femur. So you see a lot of spongy bone there. because spongy bone is less dense, it actually provides more surface area for interactions to occur. Interactions, for example, associated with calcium metabolism. Calcium metabolism can be exchanged a lot easier, or calcium can be exchanged a lot easier with trabeculae because of all this extra space than with compact bone. In fact, in some kinds of osteoporosis, like postmenopausal osteoporosis, we see a great loss in the spongy bone mass as opposed to compact bone mass. So again, to sum up, spongy bone, it actually does have some metabolism we associate with, for example, calcium flow. It also is going to be surrounded by red bone marrow. So remember the term that we associate with red bone marrow. It's actually going to be producing blood cells, and we call this hematopoiesis. So hematopoiesis is the production of blood. So that's going to be a function we associate with a red marrow, and the red marrow is what we associate with spongy bone. So that then takes us to our final consideration, looking a little bit at different kinds of bone cells. And let's start actually with osteogenic cells. Osteogenic cells are going to be stem cells, and by stem cell, they are cells that are going to be constantly producing new cells over time. In fact, they're the only mitotic cells, bone cells, that we have. The other cells come from either them or from other places. So osteogenic stem cells are going to be making more cells like themselves, and they're also going to be making osteoblasts, as you see over here. Osteoblasts, oops, go back. Sorry. Osteoblasts are going to be cells that we associate with bone building. Whenever I see blasts, these are cells that are actually going to be building that bone matrix. They're going to be building the lamellae, if you will. They're going to be using the collagen. They're going to be putting down calcium and phosphate and making hydroxyapatite, which we discussed in the last video series, that mineralized mixture that gives bone that strength. So osteoblasts are going to be making up that matrix. They come from osteogenic cells. Osteocytes are going to be maintaining the matrix. Remember, we mentioned them last time. They live in the lacuna. Where do osteocytes come from? Actually, osteocytes are mature bone cells that used to be osteoblasts. Osteoblasts get in there and they start building the matrix around themselves, and eventually they more or less trap themselves in the bony matrix and they mature into osteocytes. So osteocytes are not going to be directly building the bone as much as they're going to be communicating to osteoblasts to build bone. There's a number of signals that tell osteoblasts when to build bone. So there's going to be some different hormonal signals as well as communication from the osteocytes, and we'll deal with bone building in a future video. The final kind to mention here are going to be the osteoclasts. And how I remember this is, osteoclasts are responsible for chewing bone. The technical term is resorption of bone, but in effect what osteoclasts do is they break bone down. Now that might seem like a really bad thing to have happen, that you don't want your bone to be broken down, but actually the process of bone formation and bone resorption is very important so that our skeleton is always the right size in response to the stresses and growth factors that we have. So osteoclasts move along the bone surface, and they actually have different ways of breaking down bone. They break down the protein part of bone with lysosomal enzymes. They break down the minerals part of bone with hydrochloric acid. Eventually, they will endocytose, they will break down, they will phagocytize, they will recycle, they'll put the components back into the interstitial fluid so that we can then perhaps build bone, through the cycle somewhere else. So this cycle again of bone formation and bone resorption is a really important process for making sure our skeleton is the right size and doing the right things for its purposes. So we'll deal with that in a future video, but that will do it for now. We will stop here and we will look then at some bone structure in the next video.